And it says we're live, so I'm going to assume that we are live. So I want to welcome everybody to the program tonight. We got an interesting discussion with Carmine Hetrick. He's been here before. And we got Adam coming in. Not sure when he's going to be here, but I just wanted to open this up and say I want to welcome Carmine to the program. And tonight we're going to do like a general survey of some of the issues of eschatology that have been weighing on us during these past weeks or months. And then we're going to kind of dive in and get into the nitty gritty and tackle some particular subjects. So while we're waiting for Adam, I figured we could do just some brief opening statements as to some thoughts that we've had concerning eschatology and where we're going in the direction of prophecy studies and eschatology studies. So I guess what I'll do is I will go ahead and I'll let Carmine go first. First, I want to thank him for giving his time to meeting me tonight and talking these things over with me. Carmine, stranger to the show. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well, Brian. Thanks for having me again. It's good to be back.
Yeah, well, it's good to have you back. And we've been doing a lot of talking back and forth on Messenger. Facebook Messenger is a great venue for discussing things, but it's also it's one of those hit or miss things. You never know if you could keep a sustained discussion going on Facebook Messenger. Sometimes I have to run and do something, and I know you're probably the same way. But when we get to discuss in a forum like this where it's real time, it's just there's no holds barred. We get to discuss things that a lot of times we it's too laborious to discuss on a forum like Facebook or even like any of these other forums that we're members of. So I just want to open this up, and I want to ask you, do you have any thoughts that you've been going through, any deal things that you've been wrestling with, any general observations concerning eschatology?
Yeah, yeah. Well, you'd asked me to, prepare just a little bit to discuss about the general state of eschatology. So maybe we could open with that. Uh, I would say that my observations about eschatology as it presently stands is that it's lopsided and polarized. That those are some apt summaries, single word summaries for the present state of Christian eschatology. We have so many views to choose from, and some are nearly polar opposites of one another. At one extreme, we have dispensationalism, the predominant eschatological view among professing Western Protestants, and that views most of what the New Testament says about messianic prophecy as pertaining to eschatology, as opposed to simply being messianic. That it is the work of the Messiah that is yet to be done in our future. And at the other extreme, we have preterism, which generally views the Bible as having virtually nothing to say concerning eschatology, with most or all of its prophecy being fulfilled in the first century. And then somewhere in the middle, there are the idealists and historicists and other fringe views, which see prophecy having more of an equal distribution from the first century up to our present time. But to be honest, I don't think any of those options really present Christians as uh, generally logical, rigorous, unbiased interpreters of what the Bible has to say concerning messianic prophecy in either the Old or the New Testaments. And I think that really hurts the credibility of Christianity and therefore our ability to not only retain intellectuals or at least reasonable people within the faith, but also recruit new intellectuals to the faith. And of course, a lot of attention has been given by apologists to answering the skeptics in terms of origins of the universe and life within it, Christianity's compatibility with science, and the authenticity and lack of corruption in the biblical text throughout history. And I think that can help in terms of getting people to accept some form of theism. Okay, but the popular interpretations of the messianic prophecy of the Bible can be a significant hurdle for honest, reasonable people to overcome and accept Christian theism specifically. So, eschatology to me is a glaring weak spot among our apologists, and I believe that the honest, rigorous study of messianic prophecy, particularly eschatology, is not just fodder for petty, inconsequential quibbles and curiosities among Christians, but it's foundational to the future of Christianity as it concerns equipping the next wave of apologists.
Right, and that really makes a lot of sense. I think I see where you're coming from right now, and I just wanted to say that there was some feedback coming through about you maybe raising your mic a little bit. I tried to adjust it on my end, but it sounds like maybe if you're a little bit low, if you could adjust it, if you could pick it up a little bit, maybe that would help. Um, I don't know if you heard me.
Yep, I could do that.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So I think
Yes.
that's valid. And one of the things, I just scratched out some thoughts this morning, and I think eschatology. Well, this is where I'm coming from. Okay. So I think eschatology is at the point now where like we need to return to first principles because things have just gotten so complex. But at the same time, there's been so much relevant data proposed by theologians down through the centuries that we also need to move forward. And so there's a kind of a tension between, reverting to the original foundations and then continuing to build, but perhaps building better than we did in the past. I think you would agree. I think Adam would agree. I think everyone who's listening would agree with that proposition. The main hang up, here we go. The main hang up, I think, the main hang up. How's it going, Adam?
Sorry for the lateness, but some things can be helped.
I hear you. Well, thank you for coming in. And I was just saying I was just making like an opening statement, just some thoughts that I scratched down through this morning about the fact that I think that we need to return to first principles. We almost have to get back to the roots of doctrine because things have gotten so complex. But at the same time, there's been so many good points that have been brought out by various people, by theologians, scholars, saints, that we also have to move forward. And so we have to build, but we want to build better. And I think the main hangup is that for many Christians, I think is that evolution has so permeated our outlook and worldview that we assume that what holds true for, say, one of the exact sciences, like, say, medicine or even like, say, engineering, also holds true for theology. But theology isn't really an exact science. It's based on a lot of speculation. And I think what George Lindbeck identified as a classic cognitive propositionalist approach to doctrine, where theology develops almost like philosophy develops along the same lines. It doesn't really progress in the sense that, say, the exact sciences progress. It sort of moves in orbits, and sometimes those orbits need to be tweaked. And so, I think it doesn't make advances the same way, but I think what we have to do is rid ourselves of the notion that our theological outlook is somehow more advanced. Now, that may be true. That may be true, but that says nothing of the fact that the great truths are often lost along the way or forgotten. I mean, witness the Reformation. And so, I think that, this evolutionary idea, I think we also should keep in mind that evolution and retrogradation go hand in hand. And this is something that I've noticed across the board over the years. So take, for instance, say, the educational institutions of the United States, which have become very much more systematized and perhaps more more Clockman-like in their workings. They're very, very systematic, and they've grown and they've developed. And then literacy levels have gone down, have plummeted at the same time. And so there's an evolution, but there's also a retrogradation. There's a devolution at the same time. So what I want to say, without being too long-winded, is that retrogradation goes hand in hand with advance, and so that what we want to do, I think, is we want to, while we're building, while we're advancing our own theological perspectives, we want to remember that I think that we're delving into a pool of data that has to be filtered. I think William James said, we have to take a cross section of the data that's coming in, and nobody can take it all in, but we have to take a cross section that's realistic enough so that we can grab it all, so we can get a snapshot of the data. And I see truth being propounded by preterists. I see truth being propounded by dispensationalists. I see truth being propounded by amillennialists, post-millennialists. What I've tried to do these past years is I've tried to harmonize as many different conflicting systems, try to bring them together under a common heading. And what do I get in return? I get kicked around, I get beat up, and I get slapped, and I get spit on. And that's the story of my life. Thank you very much. Adam, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing great. And I'm really excited for the subject that you're just bringing up. I very much feel exactly what you're talking about. And I really am concerned about that in the sense of like theology and the Bible, because to me, it seems like many of the new theologians, they've forgotten the truths that older theologians held. And that's so concerning to me. And that's why I don't know what you guys will think of this, but personally, I think that Matthew Henry has one of the greatest biblical commentaries of all time. I constantly am like comparing and contrasting modern commentaries, and then I go back and read Matthew Henry, and I'm like, why is Matthew Henry's answer so much better? I was literally told in Bible school, don't use Matthew Henry. He's outdated, old. The new commentaries are better. But when I've actually looked at several passages, I'm like, dude, Matthew Henry just had such a breadth of knowledge and so many more biblical connections. He's like, oh yeah, this is connected to this Old Testament passage or this one. And the new commentaries are like almost spouting their opinions in some cases. And I'm like, yeah, why didn't you see the connection that Matthew clearly pointed out? And so I very much feel like there is a retrograde. And even if you want to talk about American, public school systems and all that stuff, like how on earth we ever got to believe, oh, there's not only two genders and all of this ridiculous trans stuff is beyond me. And so anyway, Carmine, is that how you pronounce it? I don't actually even know.
Yes, it's pronounced Carmine, exactly like it's spelled.
Nice to meet you. Okay.
Yep, nice to meet you, Adam.
Yeah, this is good. This is a good group because the reason why I got you guys together is because I noticed that both of you guys can really think for yourselves. And there's not a lot of people that can do that. Even, when I'm on these forums, today was an interesting day with forums. It was like I was on different forums throughout the day, and it was like I've noticed the pattern going forward, that everybody's, kind of had these prepackaged ideas, and they're taking these prepackaged systems, but they're not really doing the thinking that requires, that's required in parsing all the different systems. They're just saying, well, says this big, big teacher, the YouTube teacher, whatever, holds these views. Well, this is the view that I'm going to hold. This is the view that I'm going to hold. And I keep telling people, the chocolate or vanilla option that was made popular by, corporate America is not what we apply to theology. There's many different, even philosophy too. There's a spectrum of different opinions and beliefs, and there's many different conclusions you can reach by analyzing the evidence. So let me pass it back to Carmine. Carmine, I understand that your concern is to try to get more intellectual people interested in Christianity, and that's a legitimate concern. But I sense also that what's been put out there, say by preterists and futurists, doesn't really cut the icing. It's not up to spec. And so we've talked about this before, and you've suggested things such as, well, we need to get back into word studies and stuff like that. Any new developments on this? Is there anything that you've put forward in recent months that had kind of piggybacked on this, or is there any new thoughts or ideas you have on this?
Well, I have. There's lots of ideas that I have yet to publish. I think, you know, one of the biggest things that I've recently talked about with you in particular is, just the view that Jesus had concerning his second coming. You know, the way that he talked about it, and some of the devices that he used that seem to have escaped the attention of most interpreters, including preterists, which I think, you know, in general they have a much better grasp on what Jesus was saying, but I think they've also missed a layer of the literary element of what he was doing there in his use of plays on words within some of the time statements that he used that uh, preterists generally use to prove that most of what Jesus was talking about was fulfilled within that generation. But if you take seriously the concept or the idea that he was using plays on words there, then that brings a whole new element to what he was saying and what the biblical author's motivations were in recording what he said in that way. You know, in a lot of ways, that was very unexpected, at least to modern interpreters, and that can, I think, lend credibility to what he said as being something that wasn't purely human in origin, that um, it was divine in origin, and that God wasn't so concerned about convincing people that he really could see the future and that he was 100% accurate in everything that he said, that despite that, God having full confidence that his word would survive, despite initial reactions or perceptions of what he was saying, that uh, that is evidence that people weren't, you know, making this stuff up purely to cater to this idea that God was all knowing and all powerful, and that they wanted people to perceive that immediately. These are kinds of things that almost God goes almost out of his way to make himself look wrong. Okay, so I think that's one of the most recent developments that I've had. There are other things that I think tie into that it further that uh, demonstration that what is put forth in biblical prophecy wasn't what the skeptics usually claim. It wasn't that people were trying to make it like God really could see the future. They actually did some very unexpected things that you'd have to be pretty uh, observant to realize that what he was saying wasn't at all what it seemed on the surface, but that you could actually demonstrate very clearly what he was really trying to say. And from that perspective, I think there was a lot of hope from an apologetic standpoint in terms of demonstrating that the Bible is the language of the Bible was divine in origin.
I'll agree with that. What do you think, Adam?
Yeah, so I'll tell you that one of the things that I find annoying or frustrating, especially when talking to skeptics, right? And they want to say it's like, oh, the Bible's false because here's this prophecy. This is why it didn't come true. And those to me are particularly annoying when it's like, well, you obviously just didn't understand what it said. Like it's to me particularly annoying when someone just, oh, misunderstands the Bible and then says it's wrong. And that just to me is somewhat disingenuous in some ways. Because if you want to challenge something, then you should at least put its best foot forward instead of some sort of like kind of convoluted sort of issue. And I also find this to be a problem sometimes for Christians and other people in Christianity when, yeah, they misunderstand or misinterpret a text. And then they want to say, this is why your view is wrong. And they kind of just assert it boldly, yet they have no cross reference, no real particular, case beyond like, look, I read it and this is what it says. And it's obviously saying a particular thing. And so I guess I find like, you're talking about like Carmine wants more intellectual Christians to be involved. And I wish I could say that was what I wanted. I mean, I think intellectual Christians are good, and I think independent thinkers are good. But I've also come to realize that all of us are products of our culture. And now I don't know what you guys think on this particular issue, but this is the best way I know how to explain this issue. So, right now, in academia, I would say the majority, as far as I can see, of the New Testament scholars and stuff that are coming out are all coming out as egalitarian. Now, in my opinion, I think this is demonstrably false by scripture. I don't think it's true. I don't think it's correct. And yet, there are very, very good, very intellectual, strong scholars that I love their work on many other issues. And so I find this to be a real problem because it's like, well, it's not their intelligence that's an issue to some degree. Like, and, many of us can have, yeah, I don't know, a whole wide range of intelligence. So, my solution, anyway, my attempted solution is just to allow more speech, just to allow more speech. And that's the idea that it's like, how do you combat bad speech, bad ideas? Well, with more ideas, but by allowing everybody to have a place at the table and to argue freely and to be able to put forward, here's my biblical case for why I think I'm right. And so for me, the solution to these types of problems is that we don't create so many barriers. And there's always a really, really hard line between like orthodoxy and heresy and however you want to do that. But for me, that's what I want to foster is more conversation. If Brian thinks he's correct about one thing, then I want him to have a place at the table. Show me, prove to me. If Carmine's right, then prove to me, show me, because I have been absolutely amazed at how many things I believed as a young man that other friends of mine have shown me from the Bible. Oh, that's wrong. And some of them were like just hard and fast beliefs. I'm like, oh, this is absolutely true. It's what all my pastors, is what all my friends believed. And now somebody's like, oh yeah, but did you look at it here and look at these verses? Oh, I never saw that before. And you know what? I never would have seen it had my friends not had my ear and been allowed the opportunity to change my mind.
Yeah, that's great. And that's the same way with me. All I'm trying to do is, well, what about this? What about that? Well, have you thought about this before? Have you thought about that? Because like I said, with the prepackaged views, it's like we have this idea that you have to be chocolate or vanilla. And one thing that you pointed out, Adam, last time we had a discussion was you said, I'm going to call you a la carte. Because you'll take things from one system and then you'll take ideas from another system. You'll take another idea from another system and you'll put it all together. But fact of the matter is, when you start talking to people, other people don't want to do that. Well, they don't think it should be done. They think it's almost like a blasphemous way of approaching this. And the only why can't you take elements from one system and then from another system? And why can't you do that? Why can't you mix and match? And the only answer that I've ever got was in not in these words, but the only answer I ever got was, well, because you're not supposed to do that. Well, who made that rule up? All of these systems had an origin at one point in time. Preterism had an origin, right? I mean, you could say premillennialism even had an origin. I mean, I think it's the view that's being taught in Revelation, but we could put that aside. And so all of these different systems had an origin. Full preterism had an origin, if you want to say, with Max King, or maybe even a little earlier if you wanted to go back. But all I'm trying to do is get people to look at things from a different perspective. Now, the biggest barrier, and Adam and Carmine both, I think you could relate to this. The biggest barrier I've come up against rather, in my 20 years has been the smart Bible student, and I'm putting smart in quotations, okay, because I don't know how smart they are. I haven't quantified it in many cases. Smart Bible student who doesn't think that he can be taught, who thinks he's beyond being taught, who's somebody who's read some books, knows some theological lingo, knows a few Greek words, knows how to get through the Strong's Concordance, in quick time. And those are the ones that, and I'm not saying I'm not teachable, or, they can't teach me. I'm listening to everybody here. I'm listening to all kinds of scholars. But if you think you already have all the answers, and then somebody comes up to you and gives you something that might contradict one of your views, well, your natural reaction is going to be, you're going to dig your heels in the ground and you're going to say, hey, wait a minute. I had this thing figured out. I have it figured out. You're not going to tell me that I made a mistake, that I went down a rabbit trail. I've got this figured out and I know where I'm going. But in time, I think those mindsets kind of fall apart, because then, you got someone like Tristan Gabriel who's pointing out some great stuff, saying, hey, this view it's ridiculous, saying the resurrection happened in AD 70. So I'm going to toss it back to you, Carmine. How do you deal with this situation? Because you've written some great stuff on your blog as well. And I know you've come across this before, where it's like somebody's got it all figured out. They know it all from A to Z. They don't want to be taught. They don't want to be told anything. How do you get beyond that? That's not going to make intelligent Christians, is it?
Well, no. And I guess in some cases, this is a situation where you have to pick your battles. There are inevitably going to be some people that you just can't reason with inside Christianity and outside Christianity. So if you've got somebody who is that uh, opposed to at least exploring what you have to say, I'd say that they're probably not worth the majority of your time. Maybe you could plant some seeds there to make them question that. But if you've got somebody who isn't is the type of intellectual where they seem honest, they're trying to overcome some of these hurdles, but there are some significant issues, like I would say the way the New Testament writers interpreted Old Testament prophecy, and how it was to be fulfilled in Jesus as a prime example. Then I think some of these other observations can possibly help get through to them. If you can come to them and say, look, I realize there are some issues with some of the common teachings of our faith, particularly with eschatology and messianic prophecy in general. Uh, that if you can identify with them and say, look, I get it. I realize we're not very consistent. It seems like we're not very consistent, or that we're not very rigorous in how we test things, or that we're easily impressed with so-called fulfillments, then that can go a long way. And if you have something else that you can present as an alternative to try to fill in some of those gaps, that can help. But I mean, you're right. You have to have somebody who's somewhat open and is willing to at least take an honest look at a different perspective, or a new perspective, even if they haven't been impressed with what they've seen from other members of our faith in the past.
Yeah, that's very true. How about you, Adam? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that it's a very interesting subject concerning just interfaith dialogue with other believers. So this is the area that I'm more passionate about at this moment, is kind of working on like biblical theology. And I remember a while ago, I had actually told one of the leaders of the college I was going to that, yeah, what I wanted to do was kind of work on writing new theology and biblical studies. And they literally laughed at me because, of course, in their mind, we've already figured it all out. The only thing new to discover is new heresies, right? And I have found that, of course, to be demonstrably false. And of course, I will say my inspirations had been, the Christian philosophers, of the 20th century, Alvin Plantinga and Richard Swinburne. And today, my other inspiration, in case you guys haven't seen, R.T. Mullins. Ryan Mullins is unbelievable. He is absolutely brilliant. I did get to have him on my channel one time, and I was even more impressed. I had already been told by others that he was a complete prodigy and a genius. And to me, he is the modern day Michael Jordan of Christian philosophy. He's very, very articulate, extremely just open. Anyway, I just could hardly sing his praises enough. So he's not even paying me for this.
Wow. I've not heard of him. Does he have a channel?
Yes, it is the Reluctant Theologian. He has a channel and a podcast. And if you just type his name in, you will find him all over YouTube. He takes a
Okay.
lot of stuff. Now his specialty is actually the philosophy of time and the attributes of God. And so, but he has had some, to me, tremendous breakthroughs in the philosophy of time and explaining how God relates to that. And it was really eye-opening for me. And again, that was to me a great example. Great example. He framed like part of this idea of God and time in a way that I was like, never heard that before, but now I'm practically convinced. He's framed it in a way that I was like, holy cow, that is like paradigm shifting. And it makes so much sense out of not only the biblical data, but just philosophical data, logical consistency, all the other things. And so anyway, I highly recommend them concerning those aspects. But
I'll have to
anyway, I
check
don't know if
him
I
out.
answered any of your questions, but
Yeah, yeah. I think you brought up some good points. My biggest complaint today, I have new complaints every day, but I try to put them at the end of the day, is that it seems like people don't like, and this is what I've always said, people like to handle data in batches. They like to batch process data. And so psychologically, that's why they generalize. That's why they stereotype. That's also why they jump to conclusions. And it's easier jumping to a conclusion before you've gathered all the data, because we can never gather all of the data. We're always going to be getting new data in. And so, like I said, we have to get a cross section. But one of the things that got me around 2000, I don't know, maybe one or two, I started reading Francis Bacon, and he talked about he has a number of axioms. I think he calls them, he doesn't call them axioms. He calls them, there's a word that he uses, but they're like rules is what they are for proper logic. And he says that one of the big mistakes that people make is they'll start gathering data and then they'll jump to generalities. And then what they'll do is they'll take the generality and then all of the middle axioms, they'll modify, they'll make everything fit. And so I've always told people, hey, look, if your system doesn't have any loose ends, it's like you better rethink it, because the way truth is that we're always getting fresh data in. There's loose ends all over the place. And if your system is like this shiny ball with like everything, no bumps or edges or anything, and it's like everything's sleek and shiny and everything's tight, that's a sign that what you've done was you've tied everything together and you've modified the evidence, you've massaged the data. And so I always have thought of Francis Bacon as a great influence, and people for some reason they hate inductionism. Like the presuppositionalists, that's like the worst thing that you could do is mention Francis Bacon. But that got me out of preterism quickly. I'm telling you, that got me out of. I was only a full preterist for like 15 months, because it only took me a little time before I started reasoning from full preterism to universalism. And then I realized from universalism, I realized that I was massaging the data. And when I started breaking it down, I said, well, this doesn't match up, because if everybody's saved, well, why isn't God making people holy? If he save everybody, well, why wouldn't he make them holy to vindicate his salvation? Why wouldn't he, and there's other objections I had too, but I'm going to throw it back to you, Carmine. As far
can I
as,
interject for 1 second?
Go ahead.
Before you move on. So because I was giving some presentations on my work in Genesis 3. And the one question that I kept getting, and this is while I was in part of the middle of discovery. So in other words, I was uncovering some significant portions, but I wasn't completely done. And the question that everybody wanted to know from university and everything like that was like, okay, that's good, but what does it mean and what do we do with it? And I hated that question, not because I didn't feel like I could answer the question, but I hated the question because all of them wanted to know, what do we do with it and what does it mean, before any of them even had the data. So in other words, they didn't even know what the text said on a fundamental level, and now they want to know, what do we do with it? And I'm like, why are you even asking? To me, this seems incredibly irresponsible. And this is exactly how I feel like a lot of people are playing with theology today. Is all they're interested in is, okay, no. What do we do with it? And that relates to end times, that relates to all this stuff. They're trying to fit it into a box as quickly as possible before they've even understood all of what's there. They don't even understand what the text is saying. And now they want to already tell you what to do with it. And so I just find that to be incredibly irresponsible.
Yeah, it is. What do you think, Carmine? I know we had some discussions about being more, I guess, more logical about eschatology. I don't know if maybe that wasn't with you. I thought we had a discussion a while back about the logic of interpretation, or maybe it was somebody else. But what do you think of what Adam just said?
Well, I think you it is tempting, to first think about, okay, how is this, whatever you're about to reveal to me, how is this going to upset the apple cart of what I already believe, right? And that can certainly hinder how open people are to uh, new new interpretations, or even the evidence that could be used to support new interpretations. So yes, I think that's absolutely uh, something that occurs quite commonly in these sorts of discussions, and it is unfortunate. And it kind of ties back into what you were saying earlier too, Brian, about people who already have these preconceived ideas. They've already seemed to have settled on something, and it's almost like anything you throw at them, it's just that they're not open. They feel like they've already got all of the answers. So I think we do need to be judicious in how we uh, spend our time, who we share this sort of information with, because uh, it's going to take the right kind of people to be receptive to it and to uh, take it and incorporate it in with their own witness and methods of evangelism. So yes, absolutely. I think that's a great observation, and something that we do need to contend with. What we can actually avoiding those people is, uh, I guess, a matter for discussion. I don't know that I have the answers for how we can force those kinds of people to take on a new perspective. The old saying is, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. And in some cases, that's the case with a lot of people we deal with. Um,
Yeah.
so I just think we need to be diligent about who we approach, uh, learn the signs of people who are skeptical, but maybe open to considering something different, a different perspective and different evidences, and go from there.
Yeah. I agree. There was something I was thinking of when you were talking about the, leading a horse to water. The good news is, from at least for me, the people that I talk to, is I partly agree with preterism. I partly agree. There's some points they make that are correct. I don't think there's any need to deny that things were at hand in the first century. Now, I know people are going to be very, very upset about that. Some people, they're going to say, well, soon doesn't mean, soon. Like, if I'm going to come to your house soon, or I'm going to send you that Christmas gift that you've been waiting for all year long, I'm going to send it to you soon. Well, you think, well, gee, I'm not going to get it 20 years from now. I'm going to get it. I'm going to get it soon. But there's some people that will, they'll massage the words and they'll say, well, no, soon doesn't, engas doesn't mean soon. It means, must certainly. And some of those, obviously we know, those of us who have looked into the Greek, we know, yeah, there's some cases where it is used like that. But there's so much cumulative evidence for the imminency in the New Testament. My position has been, look, and I had to get honest with it years ago. I said, look, I think that the parousia was imminent in the first century, but I don't think it happened. So we have to, Jeremy posted something earlier today. It was really good, good post on one of those Facebook forums. And he was talking about the differences between Paul's earlier and later epistles. And that's something that I've talked about over the years. Won't talk about it tonight. But one book that I found was really interesting for me was George. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of George Lindbeck. He wrote this slim little volume. He was a Yale theologian. This would blow up. This guy will make an atheist doubt atheism. He's so good at what he does. It's a book about the nature of doctrine and how most of us are cognitive propositionalists. We approach theology the same way that that we approach philosophy. We think that propositional truth is the only thing that Scripture was ever meant to impart. But we know that it's not true. We know that Scripture, another purpose of revelation, was to guide us into right paths of conduct and was to amend our ways and our doings. And so there's a behavioral aspect to Scripture, and he fits this into, say, what he calls I think it's a cultural linguistic approach. He says religion isn't just a set of dogmas. It should be treated like a language or a culture. You get adept at the language of the culture and the cultural symbolism and the language symbolism. And some people are more adept than others, but things like the story of the Gospels, and the story of the cross, or the story of Abraham, or the story of the Israelites being delivered from Egypt, those fit in with a cultural linguistic understanding more so than a propositional understanding. In other words, we're to understand that in the sense of being freed from sin. And so I almost want to say he takes an almost idealistic approach in some areas, but the man he writes at such a high level. I don't have the IQ, frankly, to grasp everything he's saying right away, which is why I'm reading it and rereading it and rereading it. But the guy would blow an atheist world apart. He would definitely, Sam Frost might have this book, he might not, but I thought that was pretty interesting because, what if everything was fulfilled in AD 70? Now, what value does Scripture have as far as propositional truth? Is it something that we can quantify? Is it something we can say, well, what percentage, or should we approach it that way? What percentage applies to us today? How do we quantify what crossed over and what didn't? Is there a scientific way we can do that, or at least a way that gives us assured results? Or is it just somebody pulling out their Bible and saying, this is, this crossed over and this crossed over, but they don't really know? They can't really prove, that there's no way that you can get behind their thought processes and verify whether they're logical, whether their methodology is correct or not. So I'm just rambling on. I'm going to pass it back to you, Adam. What do you think?
Yeah, so I think I've got a couple different thoughts. One of them is just like the idea of, like, if you want to start a movement of thinkers, and I'm a little hesitant to kind of say independent thinkers, because I feel like that's almost a contradiction in terms. Oh, you want to start a movement of independent thinkers together? I don't think that entirely works. But I think that one of the things you have to do, and this is the reason why systematic theology is so much more popular, because when you have a name, right, it's easier for the next guy to follow. Right? Because he doesn't have to go through all of the hoops. Because for the most part, independent thinkers, we do 10 times the work of the other guys, because we're going through each of the information ourselves. We're analyzing the text ourselves. We're evaluating it for ourselves. We're questioning presuppositions. And that is not something that everybody else, for one, even has the time to do, regardless, of passion in some cases. And so I think it helps to capture things. If you want to have a movement and culture, then you have to find some sort of name. And so, for example, the closest thing that I can think of at the moment is like when Mike Winger says, think biblically, because that's like this idea of like, hey, look, you should go back to the text and reevaluate it, even if it's kind of unpopular. Because that's my issue with like systematic theologies. Most of the time it's Calvinistically systematic. and these types of notions. And it's like, okay, cool, but what if I don't believe in Calvinism? What if I'm not in that camp? Then it's a little tough for me to buy into a wholesale. And I don't really find a particular name for like biblical theology. Somebody wants to merely focus on like, okay, I want to follow the text and hunt that road down and try and find out like, which view is doing this. There isn't particularly, that I know of anyway, a term for that. And then the one other thing that I really wanted to touch on is I don't know if either of you guys, I don't know, Brian, if maybe one of you guys has a PhD or both do, but I have thought about this issue as far as I understand concerning PhDs, because I've read a lot of doctoral papers. I find them particularly problematic at their very foundation, because what you do is you submit your thesis in the beginning. And I just think that's ludicrous. That actually doesn't make any sense to me, because you don't know anything. How can you submit the thesis for what you're going to explain to the world before you have the data? And so to me, when I've read lots and lots of papers, and you can even see it by the schools themselves, right? They will give grants for particular topics. In other words, they already tell you what the direction is. Now they just want you to go and find information that supports their view. And that's what lots and lots of people are doing. And to me, that's one of the problems, and why academic papers aren't so great, is they already have the idea. Now they're just going to find the information to prove their thesis. They're not actually going to just try and see what's the objective truth. That's actually not in their purview most of the time. And so I find this to be terribly unfortunate and extremely harmful to the academic reaches of Christianity today.
Very good points. What do you think, Carmine?
Well, yeah, on the topic of PhDs and how the people who are underwriting this research can affect the outcomes like that, I think that is one of the real downsides to uh, things like peer-reviewed research. That is that you are, maybe unwittingly uh, conforming to their bias. I think it is really difficult to be unbiased in an environment like that because of the pressure and the safeguards and gatekeepers that you run into with what you can and cannot say, what qualifies as admissible evidence, and if that evidence doesn't fall in line with what they already believe or uh, the type of evidence that they deem credible or usable, then yeah, that can be a huge roadblock to uh, truly, at least innovative thinking. And maybe I, I suppose the case could be made that we don't really need innovative thinking right now, that it's all about preserving the gospel and preserving what had been entrusted to the saints. But from what I've seen, that's not the case. I think there needs to be innovation, because a lot of what I've seen hasn't really been up to snuff in terms of answering uh, the skeptics, particularly in reference to what they have to say about messianic prophecy and eschatology. And despite the efforts that uh, various groups of Christians have made to uh, understand prophecy, I still think it is fairly poorly understood and communicated in a way that is going to be receptive to uh, people in our uh, pseudo enlightened age, I would say.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, the issues that we converge on, I guess, are going to be preterism, full preterism, partial preterism. Because we were, yeah, Carmine and I, we were full preterists at one time. Now, I don't know how long you were a full preterist, Carmine. I was a full preterist for 15 months. But it's had lasting effects. It's had lasting effects on me, to not in a bad way. I'm not going to say it's in a bad way, but it opened my eyes to a new world of interpretation, and I think that was a good thing. Look, I still read preterist books. I've got a lot of the classic works of preterism that I read. There's some of my favorite books of theology are actually preterist books. And the reason why I like to read them is I try to see how they put these things together, and I would just like to open up these views and see what makes them tick. But at the same time, um, as a former full preterist, I understand also that things can be taken too far. And I think what I said in the interview that we did, Adam, was I said that there's a mindset among some people where if they take an extreme view, and Dr. Phil could explain this. They take a certain extremist kind of behavior and then they'll leave. They'll say, well, I'm going to, I was a 5-pack smoker a day, and then they quit. And now it's like they substitute that behavior for another behavior, but it's just as extreme. I used to work with a guy who had hair down to his, I don't even know, probably down to his waist. And then one day, I guess he was out and about and he decided to go to a barber and get it cut. Well, he didn't get just a regular haircut. He like had, shaved the whole thing like just like a really tight, crew cut. It's like, man, you couldn't like shave, like do it like shoulder length. You couldn't, couldn't have just like a regular haircut. He had to like go from like hair down to his ankles to like hardly any hair at all. And that's some people are like that. Some people are extremists by nature, and they like to maximize, they like to maximize things. And so they're not just gonna, they can't just buy a car. They've got to buy like, the not really nice car. They can't just, wear nice clothes. They got to wear like Versace clothes. But then, the problem is when you have to leave something behind and then you run to the opposite extreme, that's a problem. And so my thing has just always been middle of the road, always stay in the center. I had an ethics professor tell me one time, I asked her, are you, because she's talking about politics all the time. I said, are you Republican or are you Democrat? And she says, I'm not biting. She says, I always stay in the middle. And I tell people to always stay in the middle. And that was, I only knew her for a few months, but that was some of the best advice I ever received. That was the best advice I ever received. Adam, what do you think?
I think you need to come back over to the Amil side. So we'll happily receive you. Some people say we're in the middle. So
no. This is the thing though. This is the thing. And this is the God honest truth. I actually agree with a lot of what Amil say. I consider, and I'm glad you brought that up because I'm historic pre-mill, but I have crossover elements of Amil and post-mill. So I'm always talking about like land entrance and gaining victory for the culture. Well, that's my post-mill crossover elements where I believe that the church entered the land in AD 70. Amil would be, say when Paul's talking about being seated in heavenly places, I would see that as we're already, how would I put that? Spiritually, we've already been translated into the future millennium reign spiritually. So we are actually experiencing a millennium, but it's not the full, so I understand that. I read a lot of Amil theology. I just think the reason why I'm pre-mill is because I think when you get down to Revelation 20, that's what I think he's talking about. But now what Paul's talking about is maybe he's talking about something that we experienced before that, which is it's getting us in there. And look, George Eldon Ladd, he talks about inaugurated eschatology, how the eschaton has already broken into this age. And so we're experiencing kingdom privileges even now. It's not like the dispensationalists say, well, the kingdom's entirely future. The kingdom is here and now. but it's not the fullness of the kingdom. So I just wanted to mention that. Go ahead. I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, you're very close, and I definitely think you're way more in the middle than most of the pre-mill camp. So, and I don't know who it was that rescued Carmine from full preterism, but congratulations on getting out of the darkness there, Carmine.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks. I appreciate it.
It was a tough journey for a lot of us because, and there were some people. What I didn't want to do as well is I didn't want to become like a full preter or an ex full preterist and then do nothing but talk about full preterism. Because there are people like that. And look, I'm not going to get into names or anything, but there's people that like get hung up with the full preterist movement, and they sell their houses, and it's kind of like the opposite of what we see, with some like people who like the secret rapture people, how it's like they'll sell their car because they think the rapture is going to happen every day. Well, it's like now you get into this opposite mentality where it's like everything's covenant eschatology, everything's fulfilled. It's like, oh my goodness, we have to start the new Reformation. And so they move to be closer to churches or whatever that teach that view, and then they end up selling. It controls their lives. I think that's dangerous. Now look, I'm not. I understand, if there's a church that you really love, and you can move closer to there, that's great. But I didn't want to be the guy who would leave full preterism and then spend the rest of my days doing nothing but talking about it. And so when I was starting to get to that point where I felt like I had to continue to produce content, this was in 2011. Um, and I had to produce, like, it was almost like I was trying to be, wondering how I could, increase the shock value of what I was saying and writing, just to keep, just to keep traffic coming in. And I see that happening also with, on YouTube. That's a different story, but it's almost like, it makes you modify your content and modify your whole message just so you can continue to keep the meat grinder churning. And I said, well, I don't want to do that. So 2011, I took a break and I said, that's it, no more. I take a break. 6-month break turned into 8 years. We already talked about that. But um, studying eschatology, I think the most important thing for people, before I hand it back to you, Carmine, is whatever your view, whether you're preterist, whether you're futurist, whether you're idealist, is to try to get something from, even if it's a view you disagree with, try to get something out of it, because we know nobody's 100% wrong. Nobody's 100% right either, but a broken clock is right twice a day. So there's no, universal human experience is important. And anything that contradicts universal human experience, I think, can be falsified without necessarily any need for an empirical, analysis. So when someone says, if you say this magic word or say this phrase every time you pray, well, you'll have your prayer in 24 hours, guaranteed. Well, that's false, because it contradicts universal human experience, because that doesn't happen. It doesn't happen in every case, so it can't be a universal, can't be a law. Well, we can talk about different views, but we know that nobody in their entire life has ever been 100% wrong, and nobody's going to be 100% right. So my advice, before I pass it back to you, Carmine, would be to anybody that's watching this show that may have taken a view and they're trying to maximize their view. That's fine. You can maximize it all you want, but try to get out there and look at some other views and try to get some truth from those views. Try to find out where they're saying something that's correct, because they're going to give you another perspective. They're going to give you at least some more information that you can use, that's going to broaden your horizons. It's going to make you think differently about things, but in a good way. You really will get a blessing out of it. Go ahead, Carmine.
Sure. Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And that really ties back in with what Adam said earlier on in the discussion about, him feeling that we really, a key thing is that we really just need to allow more conversation, more reading, widen the scope of what we're willing to consider. And many of the things that I've documented as part of my research, I've come across from other individuals, and maybe they haven't or they hadn't developed it quite to the extent that I went and did with it, but it it exposed me to these different ideas about what the potential solutions to some of the problems that I saw were. I there are many aspects of what I believe that tip off that wasn't at least an option, even if the evidence wasn't there to substantiate it. It was something different that I could explore. You guys had mentioned about your views on the millennium. My view on the millennium was something that Hank Hanegraaff actually introduced me to it. Although, like I was saying, I didn't feel he really justified it very well, but it was an alternative that I thought was worth exploring, and then I was pleasantly surprised after I got to investigating it just how much evidence there was to support that particular view. There have been numerous ways in which my view on the millennium has been shaped by other uh, authors. Gordon Wenham was another biblical scholar that uh, shaped helped shape that particular view in his commentary on the early chapters of Genesis. Just some little tidbits, little things that he said that kind of resonated with me, and I thought were potential avenues for resolving some biblical difficulties that I saw the millennium being one of those. But it doesn't just end with that. There are many other observations that I've been led to, at least initially, by other folks, and I credit that to my openness to exploring other views. Um, I think part of that, though, was my familiarity with the holes and the deficiencies in these other views and arguments that I've heard from apologists and other proponents of different eschatological views. Uh, so having that discourse with as many people as possible, I think it works both ways. You get ideas, but you can also, it also clues you in on the things you might need to steer clear of, you know, that there, it exposes a lot of weaknesses in other thoughts as well. So yeah, I totally agree that the dialogue needs to be broadened and not just broadened, but I think the potential evidences that we are receptive to should be broadened as well. I think a lot of things tend to get a bad rap, especially among people who adhere to like principles like sola scriptura and that, and you know what a lot of what leads to a lot of uh, conversions to preterism is that they're not willing to go beyond what the text explicitly says, or at least that's the claim. I mean, they find ways to actually do that and still feel good about it, feel justified in doing that. Um, but as far as their primary evidences, they're reluctant to use things like typology and numerology, although all of those things do find a place within their their views. They don't. They're hesitant, or I think too hesitant, about relying on them as prime evidences for particular beliefs. And I think in some ways that's justified because it's easy to abuse those things. But at the same time, I think there's ways you can approach them with sufficient rigor that they can be used to discern uh, fundamental truths, and that those topics really relate strongest to the messianic prophecies, particularly the ways that the Old Testament prophecies were fulfilled the first time around with Christ's incarnation. But you can study these things responsibly and draw reliable conclusions about what God's intent was for the other side of the coin, Christ's second advent as well.
Now, I'd
Yeah.
like to say a couple words about the Christ prophecies, because I have found this to be a particularly troubling area to some degree for me. I've got to study a lot more about Christ prophecies just over the last few years. And I kind of grew up with, I don't know if it's traditional, but basically the view that a lot of the prophecies may have had double fulfillments. In other words, Christ was kind of a fulfillment later, but that they had more immediate fulfillments in some cases. And so it's been interesting to watch kind of academia as they've kind of been undoing, in some senses, some of the prophecies of Jesus. For example, the virgin birth prophecy from Isaiah chapter 7. Some, of course, of the modern day scholars are like, so this wasn't originally about Jesus, but rather it was about the son of Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 8. And I heard this actually from a PhD professor or PhD, Hebrew scholar, just like maybe a month ago or so. And so they're kind of going back. They're like, we need to look at this from the Jewish eyes and not from the New Testament lenses. And to some degree, I don't have a problem with that, except for I think that they're fundamentally incorrect about what the Jewish perspective was originally. I think that unfortunately, like we're talking about recently, there's been a lot of undoing because of rabbinic Judaism, which of course took place after Christ. Well, they go back to rabbinic Judaism and say, what do the Jews think about the Old Testament? What do the Jews think about these old verses? And I don't think that rabbinic Judaism was unbiased. They had their own views, especially after Jesus. And so I think that there's a great deal of shading against the messianic views. But I would propose the original meaning of many of these Old Testament passages was inherently messianic. And that was the original intent and purpose. And so I find this to be, yes, very unfortunate that many academic Christians even are going against the messianic view of some of these prophecies when I think it was there the whole time.
That's a good point. I would tend to agree with you on a lot of that, like especially Genesis 3. We did a podcast on Genesis 3. What was it, a couple of weeks ago? And
Yeah.
you agreed with me. You're one of the very first persons I've talked to in a long time who agrees that there's a lot of messianic stuff going on in Genesis 3. Now, if you ask, like, say, the critical scholars, they'll tell you, man, there's nothing going on here. And of course, the Jewish scholars, they're going to say they'll swear up and down, there's nothing messianic in Genesis chapter 3. Now, I find that very hard to believe. And this goes back to, I think this goes back to bias. I think that there's people that are biased against certain views, and they realize that, it may be reactionism. I don't know what it is. But like, if you go to like a critic, like any just university seminary, you're going to get like, they're going to teach you like JEPD and, the documentary hypothesis. And I've said this before, like, look, I've looked into some of that stuff too. And I think, well, just because there's two accounts of the creation, or there's two of this, or there's two of that, that could prove that there's more than one author, but I don't think it's a necessary inference. It could also prove other things. That's what I'm talking about. The flavor shop. It's not just chocolate and vanilla. Now we've inherited that from our culture of corporate America, where it's like you only have certain options that you can choose from. And of course, that's filtered into academia. We have certain options. There's certain theological options that you can go with, and JEPD is certainly one of them. Young Earth, old Earth. Those are the theological options. But then when you start talking about, say, if you like ask them, well, what about the gap theory? And I'm not necessarily subscribing to that, but that's kind of out of vogue now. So that's not considered an option. That's like one of the flavors that got discontinued, right? So this is the way we approach things. But what about maybe young Earth and our old Earth can be partly correct? Maybe there was an original primal creation and that got destroyed, and then God took out of that material, recreated it. I don't know. I'm not a Genesis expert. I'm just using that as an example. But the thing that I try to get people to do constantly is just try to take the biases away and just try to examine the data without those preconceived notions of, well, I have to either do this or I have to do that, which you've mentioned, Adam, in going back to the original meaning of scripture. A lot of that has to do with intuition and just having the spiritual, I guess what you would say, spiritual insight to see those things. And not everybody has that. God gives us gifts. The Holy Spirit gives us gifts. Not everybody has the gift of interpretation. I think we could frankly, recognize that not everyone who goes to seminary is going to be given the God-given spiritual gift of interpreting Scripture. There's people that are very bad at interpreting Scripture, and we've all three of us have run into them in the past. But they might have another gift that we don't necessarily have. They might have a gift of organizing, like fundraising and stuff, or like speaking in public, which I certainly don't have very much of, or a gift of, eloquence, or, just might be a real people person, go out there, knock on doors and invite people to that fish fry. There's different gifts. So, just that we try to make everything uniform and standardize everything and standardize our Christian experience to the point where we're all just like clones of one another. But that's not, if Paul was here right now, he would tell us, hey, wait a minute, this this body metaphor that I use, where you've got hands, the hands need the head, the head needs the legs, the foot, they're all connected. Anyways, I'm rambling again. I think it's let's see. I think go ahead, Carmine. Go ahead.
Right. But yeah, I could certainly sympathize with uh, your perspective on the critical attitude towards typology in the Old Testament, and I can see both sides of the coin. I agree that there are definitely messianic things going on in Genesis, maybe in ways that uh, neither of you would subscribe to. For Genesis 3, for sure, the lineage of Cain and uh,
Carmine,
Seth. Yes,
you're definitely going to have
yes,
to
Adam.
explain to me what you're thinking of there at some point. I really am. Now you've piqued my interest at some point. So you're definitely going to have to explain. Yeah, what are these other messianic pieces? I would love to hear about at some point.
Yeah, yeah, you'll be pleasantly surprised in uh, the lineage of Cain and the 8 generations of Cain, and how that culminates in the concept of a jubilee, and then how the biblical prophecies uh, pick up on that, particularly the prophecies of Daniel and Revelation. There's it's not like scholars haven't at least picked up on some of the symbolism involved in the number 8. Okay, like I was talking about numerology and how it can be used to credibly demonstrate the meanings of some important text, but that they generally see it as a symbol of resurrection. But uh, it's beyond that. It's a symbol of recursion. Okay, and Jesus also in his reference to the Queen of the South rising in the judgment to judge his generation, he's playing on that very same concept in a very subtle but demonstrable way. I don't want to derail the conversation tonight and get off on a tangent in explaining that, but that that is huge. Okay, so there are definitely ways in which uh, Genesis 3 and other passages in Genesis were typological and that they spoke of the Messiah. The key thing I think is neglected and at least hard to demonstrate is that Jesus was the messianic figure in view, with all the claimed spiritual fulfillments that he accomplished, the spiritual victories that he accomplished. Is that the type of Messiah that was being foreseen by this typology in Genesis, or are the Jews correct in looking for a different sort of Messiah? That's where I think some of the observations I've documented can fill in that void. So yeah, definitely agree with both of you guys that typology is at work in the early chapters of Genesis, and Adam, you and Pastor Ryan, was that who you were speaking to recently?
Yeah, that's right.
About yeah, about um, the concept of the devil and Satan, and this, whether was there a literal serpent in the garden or not, or was it just a symbol for Satan? And then how Ezekiel and other passages in Isaiah play on that with the concept of Lucifer and the judgments on the king of Tyre and Babylon, and if there really was a sort of secondary reference there, which I think you said you thought that there was in those passages, uh, but demonstrating that conclusively to where there's no question about it, that it's not just a matter of opinion or a curiosity that may be true, that actually was the authorial intent, is the bigger challenge. And that's what a lot of the research I've done is intended to demonstrate. Okay, that not only was there messianic themes and types and shadows in those early texts, but that Jesus was what was foreseen in those texts, and the really interesting ways and not so obvious ways, but again clearly demonstrable ways in which the New Testament authors picked up on those things. But what's amazing about it is that nobody seems to have detected it, to our knowledge of historical interpretations. Nobody's detected these things at all, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's like, wow, that is amazing that whether these guys knew what they were saying or doing or not, God was clearly behind it and put these elements in his word to demonstrate that there was something above a superhuman intelligence behind the orchestration of these ideas and how they are played on in the New Testament. And there's many examples of those, and they're key to many of our eschatological views as well. The millennium is another one of those things that uh, plays on the millennium of Adam, or at least the target millennium of Adam. Again, I've seen people pick up on these little tidbits and detect that, oh, maybe there's a little something to that, but they haven't really developed it as far as I think the biblical authors intended to take it. And so yeah, I've been talking for long enough now, but I will say I do agree with both of you gentlemen, but I think I don't know that either of you grasp the gravity of the type of evidence that can be presented for the Christianity that can be found in these passages. It's mind-boggling.
Well, I'm
Yeah.
really going to be looking forward to our future conversations, Carmine. Definitely curious to see some of the other arguments you have, and I think I
Yeah.
might be able to have a few extra things to show and stuff. Now, I do have another video that's coming out that will explain a bunch more of it, but I actually propose that Adam and Eve, they knew that the promise from Genesis 3:15, 3:16, that those are about the Messiah. And so that is, for academic work, that's entirely revolutionary, but I would propose that is exactly the original authorial intent and that it was to be understood by Adam and Eve in the narrative. And so I'll definitely look forward to some future conversations. And I think, yeah, like what you're talking about, finding ways to prove it and show it are very important aspects that we really need to kind of push back against the academics of today.
Yeah, that's a good point. My perspective is, I can only tell people what I believe. As far as proving stuff, maybe I can, maybe I can't. Now, I'm on the debate floor over at Donnie's channel. He usually gets me in a few times a year. And I've done put together some persuasive arguments, but to heck, can I prove anything? See, that's the thing. Is one of the things I found a long time ago is, and this is almost like an axiom that I developed, is nobody can prove it, or no, I mean, that's not how I put it, but there's no such thing as a good argument. Because when you make a good argument, and this is the truth, this is another one of those psychological gems that I discovered. When you're debating with someone, or when you're arguing a point, or when you're trying to convince somebody of something, what they'll oftentimes do is they'll raise the bar on acceptable evidence. And so what would a normal person would accept as evidence for, say, the virgin birth, would be, say, from my, and I keep the bar pretty at a middle height, so I can get over it, right? I would say, Jesus Christ, the virgin birth had to happen because of original sin. And I would say, and I know some of you guys probably don't believe in original sin, but because it's to bypass original sin. And that probably is also an argument for traducianism, which you probably already know is the view that holds that we get our souls come through generation, and they're not, in other words, they're not created by God. They come from our parents. And so if the process of generation were to pass on, say, this taint of sin, this inborn tendency to sin, which would ultimately make a person sin, right, and make them unfit to be that perfect lamb without blemish, then how could you bypass that? What would be the process needed to bypass that? And that would have to be a generation that was not purely natural, that was not by the normal means. And so that's why, and also would have to go back to Genesis, of where God created Adam himself. He did the work. And now, of course, the second Adam is being created the same way, or almost the same way, just simply by no intermediate process, but by the hand of God. So that would be an argument for me to consider. That would prove it to me. But then someone else is going to raise the bar, and they're going to say, but it doesn't say this. Well, it doesn't say that. Where's that word in Scripture? And so you can keep raising the bar higher and higher and higher and higher. And ultimately, there's no such thing as a good argument, because I've never met a single person who said, when you were trying to convince them, and you gave your proofs and you gave your arguments, and who said, you know what, that's a good idea. I think I was wrong about that. I think I need to change my mind and amend my ways and all of that, and go with sackcloth for a week and just show people how stupid I was all those years. Never happens. Now there's cases where you could look at some of the old time, during John Wesley's era, during old time people where, go in people's houses and read a scripture, and they'll repent right away. But I don't see that happening, not in my culture, not in my setting, not in my surroundings. So I don't know what good, when we're proving things to people, or we're trying to convince people of a certain position. I think there's a way that we can do it better without necessarily, beating people over the head with it. And that simply is, I guess, just to keep on, try to show them the big picture, which I think is the more important thing. Try to show them the big picture. And I'm going to shut up right there and pass it back to, I think it's you,
So,
Adam.
so I want to interject a little bit. Well, I know Carmine will get in here and stuff, but based on what you just said, to me, yeah, you're kind of buying into what I was proposing, which is have more conversation. You're going to help change people's minds by continuing to talk, continue to introduce information, to introduce arguments, and further the conversation. And I think the other aspect goes a little bit back to, so like you were kind of talking about how sometimes, yeah, you don't change people's minds. And I think some of that goes to Carmine's point earlier, which was you should be a little selective in who you share with sometimes, because we all know there are kind of honest skeptics where they want to know. They're asking you like, "Hey, how does this work?" And then there are dishonest skeptics. They don't care. It doesn't really matter what kind of evidence you show them. Yeah, as soon as you hit their goalpost, it will move back. You know, and I actually pushed one guy on X a little bit about this because he said that he would pay €100 to the first person that could articulate a logically consistent version of the Trinity. And I did so. And yeah, he just kind of fudged and said, well, it's not convincing to me. I was like, I showed a logically consistent version of the Trinity, pay up. Literally, it was just like, look, I showed it. This is proof. And, I had some of the other guys on Twitter just basically backing me up and basically were like, yeah, dude, look, you owe him. Like you asked for a logically consistent. He's like, yeah, but it's not convincing to me. I don't care. Like, yeah, I met all of the requirements that you wanted. And that was exactly where it's like, okay, look, he said something. Did he really mean it? No, he didn't. Right. He didn't really care. He had his own preconceived ideas. And no matter what I presented, it wasn't going to matter. Right. And that's exactly where it's like, yeah, okay, look, this is not somebody I'm going to continue to do lots of intellectually rigorous dialogue with because what I say doesn't matter. He's ingrained in his own ways and he's not going to change. And now this I very much contrast, like me and my friends, we have changed each other's minds. I have changed my views because of arguments, because of biblical evidence, and a friend going, hey, look at this, and then look at this. Oh, and then see, guess what? These things are correlated, and then finding lots of other connections. And so I would say, yeah, choosing your crowd as far as who you want to change their mind can be very important and will keep you from wasting a lot of time. And I definitely kind of have my own rules about that where, yeah, there are some people I'm not going to engage with intellectually because I know this is not going to go anywhere.
Yeah, that's true. How about you, Carmine?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. There's always going to be people that we can't convince. And that's the downside to these one-on-one dialogues and equipping people for sort of private evangelism, right? Is that so often you end up wasting your time that your words fall on deaf ears. Um, but that's where I think mediums like the internet and YouTube are so important because I know from my own personal experience, there are honest skeptics out there. I was one of them. And I was sincerely trying to uh, convince myself that uh, Christianity was true. And there had been different times where I thought I had found that evidence that I was convinced. And then I'd learned something else, and then I'd realized that that wasn't what I believed wasn't as compelling of an argument as I originally thought that it was. And I continued to hear these sorts of arguments from Christian apologists, and even among people that I came to respect in like the preterist community, and that because I really felt that they had a probably the most biblical view of eschatology of all of the options that were out there. I now think that they have some neglected some very important things, but at the time I thought they were were right on the money, and I respected them. But then when it came to other topics relating to like messianic prophecy or convincing demonstrations that the Bible was divine in origin, I felt that the evidence they found impressive was not really as impressive as they thought, that they were misinterpreting it, the significance of these aspects of the prophecies or the history or the texts or whatever. But uh, as I continued studying, even after preterism, I really felt, after really evaluating it, it filled in some gaps for me in the arguments that I had heard from skeptics before, that I thought the skeptical arguments were failing to provide. So, uh, but all I know was that I was honestly trying to find the answer. Christianity was appealing to me in many ways. Other ways, not so much. But for the majority of what Christianity taught, it was appealing. It was something I wanted to believe. But there were some pretty high hurdles: biblical prophecy and concerning the Messiah, and eschatology, or specifically eschatology, that I found very difficult to overcome. Uh, and it was the dialogue that I was having with other people that eventually led me to what I believe is the truth, and what led me back to the faith. But if it weren't for these public dialogues, not just these private dialogues, but uh, public debates, public teachings that people were putting out there, that really presented me with some ideas. So I guess to combat the staunch uh, uh, resistance, I guess, to evidence, or where you run into these people who just don't really care to know the truth, the dishonest skeptics, to avoid them, is to make use of these resources that we have nowadays to uh, at least get what we have to say in front of those honest skeptics. And then they can help us to discern who is worth sharing this message with. And they can take that to the private conversations that they wish, or that they feel are worth having. And from that perspective, we can gain some strength in numbers. But before we get there, though, I think we just need to come up with better arguments in some respects to cater to and help these honest skeptics overcome uh, the hurdles that they have to accepting Christian theism as the most justified interpretation of all the evidence we have accumulated to date.
Yeah. And I think it's okay to be I think it's okay to do it the easy way too, or I should say the lazy way, as a lot of people do on the internet, and just say, "Hey, look, I'm a Methodist or I'm a Lutheran. I believe in the Augsburg Confession. Here it is. There's all the proof texts. I'm a Calvinist. I believe in the Westminster Confession. I believe, they've got proof texts and everything. They've explained it already. Now we need to go back to this, or we need to go back to that." And I don't like that approach, but I think it's something that a lot of people feel comfortable with, where the work is already done for them. There's not a lot of people out there that are searching. I know I'm personally not searching for anything right now. I haven't been searching for anything in a long time, because I feel that I found the basic answers. And I put the more of an emphasis on just following Christ and trying to be a decent human being. And that, I think, is the challenge for most of humanity, whether you're a Christian or not, whether you're a Buddhist, whether you're a Muslim, is trying to live a life where you're in balance with your ideal self and your actual self, and where the two are in harmony. And Christianity is no different. Of course, we have different goals that are put before us that we need to try to live up to, but whether they be faith goals, or whether they be, aspirations to a higher holiness or whatever. But I think it's okay to accept a prepackaged worldview or a prepackaged system, as long as as long as that's what suits your needs. But now it's the guys that are searching that don't have the answers or feel that they're not being given the right answers. Those are the guys that need folks like, say, you and Adam and myself. And for those guys, I would just say, hey, look, we can just keep presenting these tidbits of information, and we can open the floor to other people and say, hey, look, if you want to jump in and you want to chime in and give us your perspective as well, that's great. But for my part, I'm not going to be like I'm like this high and mighty person. I'm just going to tell you what I believe. And I'm not pulling any punches. I'm not going to, pretend that I'm, that I'm Miss Joe Flash or anything of theology, but I'm just going to say, look, this is what I believe, and this is why I believe it. And if someone wants to accept that, they can accept it. Like the coming of Christ in AD 70. Yeah, I believe it was at hand. I believe everything was at hand. He could have come in the first century, but he didn't. And so an inquiring mind would want to know, right? If he really he didn't come back, well, why didn't he come back? Maybe there's an answer. So again, we got the flavor shop going on, because the skeptics will tell us, well, you see, there's proof that God's not true, but that's only one that that's only all that means is that it could lead to that conclusion, right? It could, but then there's other options as well. So my thing has been to explore those other options and to try to open up those other options so that people aren't looking at prepackaged views. But if you want to do the prepackaged thing, I mean, you're welcome. I mean, I don't have a problem with someone being like, I'm a Methodist or I'm a Lutheran, and that's what fits me. I'm a Catholic or I'm Eastern Orthodox, and I want to accept what they've formulated. That's perfectly fine. It's freedom of religion. It's the USA. Gentlemen, we're coming into the past the 90-minute mark. Did you guys want to say something? Did we want to wrap this up? Maybe we could you guys could have some closing thoughts, maybe. All right, did you want to do that?
Sure. Who would you like to start with, Brian?
Oh, you could go.
Okay. Well, yeah, I guess I would just say in closing that, uh, especially this time of year, where you're bound to be hearing uh, prophecy citations of Old Testament prophecies concerning the birth and the early life of Jesus, I would just ask people to reflect on how they might justify such beliefs and how they how those justifications might appear to an honest skeptic. If the justifications that you've learned of through whatever mediums you were educated under or educated yourself under, do those explanations sound logical? Are they justified uh, t- to the satisfaction of somebody who was sincerely evaluating your your faith, uh, to see if it was something they could believe in them themselves? And I can say, for me, the common explanations that I heard that are common among Christian apologists, they were not convincing, and uh, they came off sounding more like excuses for failed prophecy, for ideas that came about as a result of the time for the Messiah coming and going, according to the prophecies of Daniel 9, and that these popular interpretations and applications of Old Testament messianic prophecies uh, were not convincing to me, and they're not convincing to other honest skeptics. And if you do reflect on this and come to that realization yourself, uh, I just want to say that I think there is hope that you can find explanations for why we are justified in believing that there were secondary references to prophecies like Isaiah 7 through 8, the typology at work in Genesis 3, the secondary fulfillments of things like Psalm 22 and Isaiah 53. All of those, while on a surface reading you might not think there is compelling reason to look for any future fulfillment of any of those passages, that there are actually some substantial uh, indications that the authors were looking beyond their initial time frame. And you see this element in the messianic prophecies of Christ's first advent, and those can carry over to your eschatology as well. Those very specific messianic prophecies concerning the end. Okay, uh, we see those same things at work in some very vivid, very convincing ways. And if those things interest you and you do agree with me that there is hope in that, you can find a lot of documentation of such supporting evidence on my blog and my YouTube channel as well, including some of the interviews I've done on this channel with Brian and elsewhere. So I think that pretty much sums up what I wanted to get across with this discussion tonight.
Well, thanks, Carmine. It's been a pleasure having you on and hearing your feedback. We're going to have to talk more about that in the future because I think you got a lot to offer. How about you, Adam? You have any last words, any parting remarks, anything you forgot to mention or you wanted to bring out?
Yeah, number one, I just want to echo what Carmine said concerning, honest intellectuals. If you're an honest skeptic, then I encourage you to dig deep. And I encourage you not to put all of your eggs in one leader or one pastor. So, you know what? I was very much a skeptic and a rationalist kind of growing up. And I was a Christian, but there came a time when I was very, very serious about my skepticism and I wanted to know if Christianity was true or not. And I went to pastors and I went to many of the normal leaders that you would go to, and they did not give me answers. In fact, some gave me kind of your standard, you just need to believe more type of answers. And those, of course, were entirely unsatisfying. But as I kept searching, I eventually did find answers, or in some cases, I was able to find the answers on my own. In other words, I was able to look through the textual evidence and find, like, oh, wait, here is the solution. And so there were good answers to the questions that I had, even if the person that I trusted at that moment didn't have the answer. And so this is something that I find very unfortunate about those that are kind of dishonest skeptics, or maybe they even seem like they're honest skeptics. But then when they ask the questions, their questions are so shallow, it's very difficult to take them serious. And so that's one thing I would say is pursue the truth and pursue it as honestly as possible. And don't just allow one Christian's answer to be the end all be all of answers. And for the Christians who are out there, I just want to encourage them to study their Bibles and to dig deeper and to not think that what your pastors, what your seminary professors, what all of those other people have told you is the end of the story, and that all of those teachers have it all figured out, because they don't. They just don't. And I think that there is lots of great work being done in Christianity, being done in Christian apologetics, and other people are creating and devising better answers, better explanations than in the past. And so if you are one of those people that is so intellectually inclined, called by God to be a teacher, please dive into your Bible, challenge the presuppositions, challenge the traditions, and make all of the traditions and preconceived ideas submit to Scripture and to God's word.
Great advice. Well, I want to thank you guys for coming out tonight and having this discussion with us. I also want to thank everybody who weighed in. We had some questions come in, but they were kind, it would take us a long time to get through them. But most, leave your questions in the comments section on the video, and we'll try to answer them as we have time. I want to thank everybody, and I hope we can do this again real soon. Thanks all.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks,
Yep,
Carmine.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks, Adam.